The integument. We're shifting gears into really our first unit or organ system that's new material. We've had new material, but now we're going to actually put a lot of the histology and the tissues and the architecture, we're going to package it into an organ system, and now we're going to start using all of these basic principles that we were covering in our first unit. Okay? So the integument, or the skin. Largest organ in the body. The skin, or the integument, the word integument literally translates to covering. The Latin word translates to a covering. It's the biggest organ in the body that you have, and it's the one that you see. So a lot of times we know when things are going wrong with it because it's very obvious. If you have a lesion, if you have an abnormality, if you have something going on with this organ, you visibly typically see it. Well, the same types of things can happen cardiovascularly, in blood vessels of the heart, but unless you go in to see a specialist who can see something that you can't see using technology and imaging, you have no clue what's going on. Okay? So this is an interesting organ to start with, and actually one that I've spent a lot of my time studying. The skin's called an organ. Why? Well, it's because it has many, many components. There's different components, and it's not just there's the epidermis and the dermis, which are technically the two regions of skin. I don't mean components in that way. Those are two regions, but within those regions, we have many different components. We have tactile receptors. We have sweat glands. We have pain receptors known as nociceptors. Okay? We actually have pigmentation that serves a UV protective nature. We actually synthesize vitamin D. We have many different components in this tissue, therefore it's an organ. So we have these different regions that I just alluded to. Well, the two regions of the skin that are technically regions are called the epidermis, which is the superficial most covering, and then we have the dermis, which is the underlying layer. And then deep to the dermis down here, we see what we call the hypo, or which is a word that means under the dermis. But the hypodermis is not considered part of the skin. The hypodermis is made up of a lot of fat. That's where we get our adipose-derived stem cells from liposuction. Is subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous fat is in the hypodermis. Now the hypodermis, with all that fat tissue, I told you earlier, fat tissue is very well vascularized, so that hypodermis is extremely well vascularized. What does the skin do? Functions of the skin. A lot of times students will say, okay, it protects, prevents water from getting out. Right. Those are two definite functions of the skin. But it does some other things too. Communication. What? Communicate with your neighbor just using skin appropriately. Go. You need to ask what appropriate is and pick something else. Alright, I saw some fist bumps. I saw some cheap brushes, which was kind of interesting. Maybe they're close, you know, that's cool. Study partners can really get into the material. So, communication with our environment, right? Our skin tells us that you didn't walk out the door forgetting your socks, your shoes, or your pants, for crying out loud. Okay? You are communicating with your exterior environment using your skin. Right? You know what's going on. You know if it's breezy. You know if it's cold outside. Okay? So we have tactile receptors, and we have temperature-sensitive receptors, and we have pain receptors in the skin. Well, it's a site of waste secretion. Sweat is a secretory waste. That means it's filtered, right? Filtered fluid, and you release the waste product in the sweat. So you secrete waste products. Protection, an obvious one, right? It protects against bacteria coming in. It protects against viruses coming in or microbes. It even protects from abrasion. Okay, so if you accidentally bump up against the wall, it's not like this entire limb is traumatized. Your skin, if it's working correctly, will protect you. So we a lot of times say, especially during this season, it's flu season, there's pretty aggressive colds going around right now. So you should be washing your hands frequently. So how do you guys wash your hands?
Soap and water.
With soap and water. That's a good way to do it. Give me some more details. Like what kind of soap you use. Okay. Hot water, cold water, how long?
Try and get some soap in your nails.
Soap in the nails. Okay. Any ideas? Any other ideas too? You sing the ABCs when you wash your hands? Okay. So warm soapy water for at least 20 seconds in any one sitting is what's recommended. Obviously anything beyond that's good. Right? Now there was a study that was done by the Center of Disease Control. This was done in the city of Chicago, which is a very dirty city, by the way. If you're from Chicago, I apologize. But there are some very dirty parts of all inner cities, right? So this is a Chicago-based study. The Center of Disease Control was looking at a population of patients who used antimicrobial soap and another population of patients that used, subjects that used just regular soap. Okay? They followed these patients for an entire year, and they were looking at all sorts of outcomes. How frequently they get sick, okay, what kind of illness it was, how reoccurring it was. What did you think they found between regular soap and antimicrobial soap?
The antimicrobial soap takes off the good bacteria on your hands that helps fight against other bad bacteria.
Okay, well they didn't even find that in that study, but that is true. Your biofilm that you normally have that makes you you, it actually kills those too. What, do you think they found any difference in infection rates or flu rates or cold rates between antimicrobial soap and regular soap? No, they didn't find any difference. What they found to be the biggest difference was the length of time you were washing your hands, and that's where that beyond 20 seconds. There was a big drop. If you washed your hands less than 20 seconds, then you were more susceptible to not getting the harmful bacteria off, and you're more likely to have some sort of cold or virus or infection associated with it. Okay, so these antimicrobial soaps are a little bit more of a marketing ploy, right? And so if you're buying soap, you don't necessarily have to buy the antimicrobial expensive. It's more important that you have hot water and you do the appropriate time. Okay? All right, so what else does the skin do? It regulates body temperature. How does it do that? How does it regulate body temperature? Blood vessels. Negative feedback. Ooh, I like that. Negative feedback loops. Okay, pulling in some old stuff. That's good because this is a cumulative class. Right? So don't forget what we learned in the first unit. These negative feedback loops, we talked about this thermostat example, and we talked about how the vasculature works in the back.
It puts a layer between you and the outside world.
It puts a layer between you and the outside. It insulates you. That's correct. If you want to alter your temperature using blood vessels and with a negative feedback loop, let's say that you're hot. What are you going to do? You're going to vasodilate. You're going to increase perfusion to the organ of the skin. What that does is it takes the hot blood from the core, or the warm blood from the core, it puts it to the surface, and it allows for convective heat loss, it allows for evaporative heat loss, and it allows for conductive heat loss. Okay? Evaporative heat loss is the most efficient, and that's utilized or happens as a result of sweating. Now, if you're cold, what do? You vasoconstrict and you shunt blood away from the surface of the skin or the organ, and you move it into the core to preserve the heat. And that's why when you're cold, your extremities are really cold, and your feet and your hands may turn blue, because you're not getting adequate amounts of blood flow. You're trying to conserve that heat. Okay? You do shiver as well. Shivering is an inefficient mechanism of muscle contraction. And as you shiver, you rub two filaments together, okay, like the old Boy Scout method of trying to create a fire. And that builds friction and creates heat. Okay? So the skin, communication, function, secretion of waste products, function, protection, regulation of body temperature. What else? Metabolic functions. Okay, this is from a 2000 publication by Javelinsky and Chaplin. And this is showing, up in the upper right, an en face view of the skin. What does that mean? That's a face-down view. So it's like if you took a picture like this. So it's not a cross-section. You're taking a picture here, and what do you see? You see what looks kind of like structures that look like fried eggs. Right? So these are very, very fat and flat cells. If you looked at them from the side, they would be very, very thin, and that's what we're used to seeing in a cross-sectional view of our squamous architecture. So here, instead of looking at it from the side, you're looking at it from a top-down view, or what we call an en face view, and you're able to appreciate that there's these junctions in between. And this is a nucleus. And you're like, well, wait a second, Keller. I thought that the superficial most layer of the skin is anuclear. It is. You're looking through a number of layers and seeing a nucleated layer below it. You're looking through translucent skin and seeing layers below, and that's where that nuclei is showing up.
I have a question. Don't dead cells still have the nucleus?
No.
No?
No, they get rid of them. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So metabolic functions. If you look here, the whole idea here is actually to develop vitamin D. The most active form of vitamin D is called calcitriol. And that's actually this word right here, calcitriol. This is the active form of vitamin D in this box. The chemical name is 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D, otherwise known as active vitamin D, otherwise known as calcitriol. Well, you can get calcitriol from two main sources. You can get it from your food, and it comes in the format of vitamin D2. Now, if you can see the little subscript 2. Or you can manufacture it. You make it yourself. You manufacture it at the level of the skin. You take sunlight and you convert sunlight into vitamin D. How do you do that? Well, if you look at this reaction, you can see that cholesterol precursor, 7-dehydrocholesterol, when it's exposed to UV light in the skin, this little thumbnail is the skin, it converts it into a form of vitamin D, and then it shuttles it to the liver to manufacture calcidiol, and then it shuttles it to the kidney to create calcitriol, which is this circle structure would be this box right here. This is the most active form of vitamin D, calcitriol. Well, who cares? That's great that you just showed me this sort of long, complicated, mechanistic reaction. Why do I need vitamin D? Well, vitamin D does a couple of things. Vitamin D is critically important for calcium absorption out of the intestines. Vitamin D is critically important for absorbing calcium out of the kidneys and not excreting it in the urine. So vitamin D, calcitriol, the active form, is critical if you want to grab calcium out of your diet. You need calcium in the bones to create a solid architecture. So the health of the bones is dependent on calcium, and whether or not you have enough calcium coming into your body is dependent on how much vitamin D you have. So there's a direct correlation or connection between strong bones, calcium levels, and vitamin D levels. Okay?
I know that we make vitamin D from the sun, but are there any foods that we could find vitamin D in?
Yeah, you can find vitamin D2 in lots of foods that you eat, like dairy products, okay, like milk and cheeses. But some people, you know, can't have a lot of dairy.
But that'll do the same thing as absorbing the sunlight, right?
No, it won't. It won't do enough of it. There's been plenty of studies in patients that don't have enough sunlight, and these are usually children. And when the children don't have enough sunlight, even if they're eating enough vitamin D2 out of their diet, they're actually getting mal-produced bones. So you need both. You absolutely need both.
Why would children have more problems with the
Well, we'll talk about that after lecture, okay? So, hypodermis. Hypodermis is not part of the skin, but what does it do? What does it do? Well, it helps to allow for movement to take place. Because that outer strong layer has to be connected to an underlayer that's connected to everything else. Okay? You don't want this outer armor to be so stiff and not have any mobility for us to be able to have dynamic motion. So it allows for movement to take place. It's a shock absorber. Right? It absorbs the shock and protects us from the outside environment. It's an insulator, like what we talked about earlier. It helps regulate our temperature by preventing heat loss or preventing heat exposure in some cases. But it's not present everywhere. There's a distribution that's different between males and females, and it's in greater percentages in these highlighted regions within males and within females. And the distribution of fat is actually dependent upon the sex hormones. And that's why you see a difference between the two sexes.
Would this be the dense, irregular connective tissue, the hypodermis?
Hypodermis is mostly adipocytes, fat cells. Okay, so I want you to pose this question. The skin consists of the epidermis and the dermis. So why do we give injections that are in the hypodermis rather than the two upper layers of the skin? All right, talk it over. What do you guys think? Why do we give injections in hypodermic needles? It's very vascularized. Okay, remember, it's primarily adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is well vascularized. So if you give an injection into the hypodermis, the drug that you're trying to deliver will be uptaken rather quickly into the vasculature. Okay? All right, moving on. Shifting gears to focus on the epidermis, and then we'll focus on the dermis. This epidermis is the superficial-most layer. It consists of, two main types. We have epidermis in what we call thin skin, and we have epidermis in what we call thick skin. Now, the thin skin is over most parts of the body. It's only 4 layers. We'll talk about the difference between them in a second. And it's about 75 to 150 microns in thickness. The layer that it's missing is the layer known as the stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum is the layer that's missing. If you contrast thin skin to thick skin is found primarily on the palms and the soles of the feet. It's 5 layers. It includes the stratum lucidum layer. And it's about 400 to 600 microns thick. There was a question, I think, a week or so ago about calluses, right? That might have been your question, actually.
Yeah, that was me.
Okay. Because I remembered, maybe. I don't know. Alex asked, what are calluses? And I said that we talk about it here. So calluses. Most of these calluses are found either on the palms of the hands or the soles of the feet. Okay? And when you have regular abrasion, because we walk on our feet and we use our hands a lot, you see a lot of calluses, especially in trades, folks. People that swing a hammer, okay? I have them on the ends of my fingers like crazy from tight. No, I'm just kidding. But the calluses that develop are the extra thickening of that layer of skin, the epidermis. This is the layer that thickens. And it's the stratum lucidum layer and up that gets progressively thicker as a protective barrier, and you really only find it in thick skin. Okay? So, thick versus thin. If you look at them side by side, you can kind of appreciate the differences between the two. And you can see a much thicker layer of cells in thick skin than in thin skin. Most of the times that we use preparations in laboratory for teaching, we're going to pull a thick skin sample because you get all 5 layers. But it's interesting because it's really only a small percentage of the body that actually looks like thick skin. Okay? Can you find thick skin in other areas? Yeah, you absolutely could. But usually it's because it's not really a pathology, but it's not really normal to have thick skin in other places. But if the person, you know, is constantly wearing maybe a bag or a backpack, or, you know, a piece of equipment is constantly rubbing in that region, then the skin will respond by thickening over time. Okay? And those calluses on your hands can get progressively worse or more pronounced if, you know, the physical labor is continuing, and they go away or they resolve if it fades. So if we look at the different layers, we're going to start out at the deepest layer known as the stratum basale. Basale, the word basement, right, has basale really as a root word. So the lowest or deepest layer, the stratum basale, is closest to the blood supply. Remember that this epidermis is not vascularized. It's supercell dense, and it's very matrix poor. There's more cells per area, so there's not any room for vasculature. So the skin has to get its blood supply from the underlying dermis through diffusion. Now, the regenerative layer is this layer. This is the layer that gives rise to subsequent layers. And as this layer divides and produces a next layer of cells, it moves up. And then it moves up again. And then it moves up again. And slowly over the process, it's actually starting to change its phenotype. It spits out organelles at some point. It gets rid of its nucleus. It flattens in profile and becomes squamous or squamous. But at the basale layer, you see keratinocytes and you see melanocytes. These keratinocytes and these melanocytes, this is pseudo-color down here in yellow, so that you can identify which one is the basale layer. And these keratinocytes produce a protein known as keratin. This is a very structurally solid protein. So it gives tremendous strength to the skin, keratin, made by keratinocytes. That should be easy to remember. The other thing that keratin does is it's actually very hydrophobic. It's a protein that's hydrophobic. And so there is some waterproofing characteristics by making keratin as well. The second cell type we find in the stratum basale layer are melanocytes. Melanocytes make a product known as melanin. Melanin is a brown pigment that we've talked about. I've showed you a picture of unstained skin in a subject, a patient, that actually had darker coloration to the skin. And you can appreciate, remember the little brown spots? That's melanin. It's a product from melanocytes that gives skin its pigment, but it's not really, that's the only thing it does. It doesn't just make us, you know, different shades and make us beautiful. It actually causes UV light to not come through. So it's a natural sunblock. Melanin is a natural sunblock that offers UV protection. Then lastly, but not least, we have these Merkel discs. Merkel discs are sensitive to pressure. We call them tactile discs. Okay, tactile discs. So these would be sensitive to more light types of touches or pressures because they're found relatively superficial. The other ones are found deeper in the dermis. Okay, this one's at the level of the epidermis. So we're going to make our way up. Stratum spinosum is our next layer. The stratum spinosum is just superficial to the stratum basale layer. Yes?
The Merkel disc?
Yeah.
The same thing as Meissner's?
No, they're different than Meissner's corpuscles. The Meissner's corpuscles are actually found in the dermis, okay, just below where these Merkel discs are. So they are uniquely different. We'll get to those when we cover the dermis, but probably not today. Okay? The stratum spinosum, you still have some division. This one's pseudo-colored orange. So down here is our stratum basale. The orange coloration is the stratum spinosum, the next superficial layer. Still some cellular division and some turnover, but it's starting to slow down. Okay? It slows down as it moves up, or superficially. You see in this layer what we call dendritic cells. The dendritic cells are immune cells. Dendritic cells are immune cells. A lot of times students get confused that a dendritic cell has something to do with a neuron. Okay? Because neurons have dendrites. The dendritic cell is a word that means branching like. Okay? So a dendrite has a branching-like appearance. A dendritic cell has a branching-like appearance as well. So these are immune cells that are phagocytic in their nature, meaning something comes in from the outside environment, makes it to the stratum spinosum layer. The dendritic cells identify it there and say, oh, you have crossed too far into the border. I'm going to engulf you and show a piece of you off so that we know that we have an invader. Okay? So these are like sentinel soldiers that are found at the level of stratum spinosum. It's kind of cool.
They're border security.
They're border security, that's right. Okay, border security. I like that. You find these not just in the skin. You find them in the lining of the nose. You find them in the lungs. You find them in the stomach and the intestines. Should make sense. Because those are all linings at epithelial interfaces, like here, that could experience a foreign invader. Okay? So you put border security in all those places, so to speak. Yes? Oh no, they're not just solely in the spinosum, they're just predominantly here. You might find them a little bit higher up, you might find them in the granulosum, and you might find them in the basale. So they're kind of in this region, but mostly you see them in the spinosum layer. Superficial to the spinosum is the granulosum. It's about 3 to 5 cell layers thick. This is where you get the organelles starting to disintegrate. And as the inside contents of the cell are disintegrating, programmed, because they're getting further away from the blood supply, so they're starting to methodically die off, or slough off, you package them up and you see granulation. So that's why it's called the granulosum layer. You see these granules. As you exocytose out the contents of the cell, now the cell kind of starts having the ability, instead of a nice fat round cell, to kind of start squishing down. And in addition to that, that lipid-filled vacuole that's exocytosed helps with keratin to continue to waterproof the skin. Because as you work your way superficially, you want more and more waterproofing. So that lipid that comes out helps to waterproof. This is the layer that truly forms the boundary or the barrier between outside of the body and the inside of the body. It's granulosum layer.
What is a granule?
The granules are disintegrated organelles as they're breaking down. And you see them as like these dots.
Okay.
Yep.
And they release what? What did you say?
Well, the granules don't release anything. They're just the organelles kind of being packaged.
Okay.
And then when the vesicle that houses the granules fuses with the membrane, it dumps out those contents, and a lot of lipid comes with it.
Okay.
And that lipid is fat, and fat is hydrophobic, and so that helps waterproof the skin. Okay? All right, stratum lucidum. Oops, sorry. Superficial to that, stratum lucidum. So the stratum lucidum is only present in thick skin. You don't see any organelles in this layer. That's why it has a clear appearance to it. So the word lucidum, from the Latin, it means light. Right? So Lucifer was the angel of light, right, before he made bad decisions. And so lucidum, right, Lucifer is the angel of light. This is the light layer. That's what it refers to, specifically. The other reason that it's staining very, very light is because it doesn't have organelles and it has a protein in it, a precursor protein known as elidin. E-L-E-I-D-I-N. Elidin is another protein that helps to give strength and waterproofing characteristics to the skin. Only present in thick skin. And then last but not least is our stratum corneum. Stratum corneum. This is a completely keratinized layer. Dead cells here. We have dead cells in lucidum as well. We have dying cells in the granulosum layer. Here in the corneum layer, it sheds constantly. You renew the skin about every 6 to 8 weeks. 6 on the short end, 8 on the long end. So the skin that you have today is different than the skin you had during finals week. Okay? You're like, thank goodness. Okay? Slough that off. So it renews constantly. You shed about 1 pound of stratum corneum every year. Yep, isn't that awesome? Or disgusting, depending upon your perspective. 30 layers of dead cells, packed keratin, very strong. And one of the proteins that shows up in the layer just beneath this, which is the lucidum layer, elidin, there's another one known as filaggrin, F-I-L-A-G-G-R-I-N, filaggrin. Filaggrin shows up in the lucidum layer and then continues on in the corneum layer, and it actually helps to squish the cell down into a squamous, flattened shape. So if we look at them together, side by side, you can see the H&E stain here and then the pseudo-colored reconstruction from the superficial most down to the deepest layer. Okay? Questions? This is where we're going to stop. We'll pick it up here on Monday.